Kriegsmarine told its destroyer men that they were the cutting edge of German naval power. That was not propaganda whispered from the margins. That was the institutional claim, stated without irony in fleet orders and officer briefings from the first day of the war to nearly the last. The destroyer force, the Zerstörer, was described in Kriegsmarine doctrine as the most aggressive surface element available to the fleet. These were the men expected to execute torpedo attacks against enemy capital ships. These were the ships meant to screen the battleships Scharnhorst and Gneisenau through the North Sea. These were the vessels that would strike where the enemy was weakest, then disengage before the enemy could answer. Recruitment materials described a life of speed, initiative, and tactical independence. Destroyer captains were painted as modern incarnations of the imperial naval tradition. Bold men, technically accomplished men, officers trusted with small ships and enormous responsibilities. The Kriegsmarine said this demanded exceptional men. What the Kriegsmarine did not put into those fleet orders was the casualty figure that defined what that exceptionalism actually cost. Of the 53 destroyers the Kriegsmarine commissioned and operated during the Second World War, 31 were sunk in combat or lost to operational causes before the war ended. That was a destruction rate exceeding 58%. But the raw number understates the reality, because the losses were not spread evenly across 5 years of war. They were concentrated, brutally and almost unbelievably, in April 1940, in the waters of a single Norwegian fjord. The Kriegsmarine lost 10 destroyers in the 2 engagements over 3 days. 10 destroyers, in a fleet that had commissioned only 34 by that point in the war. A full third of the entire operational destroyer force was at the bottom of Ofot Fjord before the Norwegian campaign had even reached its second week. The doctrine that called these ships the cutting edge of German sea power had not been written for the geography of Norwegian fjords. It had not been written for the fuel states that stranded 10 ships in waters they could not leave. It had not been written for the specific catastrophe of facing British destroyers and battleships at point-blank range in a space too narrow to maneuver. The men who served on those ships, and the men who replaced them, and the men who later served in the Baltic, the Channel, and the Arctic on every German destroyer that survived Narvik, inhabited a reality the institutional materials had not described. And for the duration of the war, that reality would not be honestly acknowledged. The Zerstörer of the Z class, which formed the backbone of the German destroyer force from 1938 onward, was, by many engineering measurements, a formidable ship. Z-class destroyers displaced between 2,200 and 2,600 tons at full combat load, depending on the specific batch. They measured between 119 and 127 meters in length. Their main battery was 5 out of 12.7 centimeter guns in single and twin mounts. They carried 8 53.3 centimeter torpedo tubes and 2 quad mounts, and an anti-aircraft battery that expanded significantly as the war progressed. Their propulsion plant was a high-pressure steam system. 6 Wagner boilers on the earlier ships, operating at 70 atmospheres and 450 degrees Celsius, driving 2 shaft turbines to a combined output of approximately 7,000 shaft horsepower and a maximum speed of 38.5 knots. The claim was the cutting edge. The documented reality began in a fjord. To understand what German destroyer service actually cost the men assigned to it, one must begin where every honest accounting of the Kriegsmarine surface fleet must begin, with the material and geographic constraints that the Navy's leadership understood before the first shot was fired, and with the doctrine governing destroyer operations, which chose to treat those constraints as manageable complications rather than fundamental limitations. That speed figure, 38.5 knots, was theoretical. In practice, it was almost never achieved. The high-pressure steam plant was the defining technical reality of German destroyer service. It was a reality that Kriegsmarine leadership had accepted as a calculated risk during the pre-war design process. And it was a reality that the men who maintained and operated it lived with as a daily physical condition for the entire war. The Wagner boiler system was the most advanced marine steam technology Germany had available in the late 1930s. It produced excellent power-to-weight ratios. It permitted the high speeds destroyer doctrine required. But it also demanded maintenance standards and operational precision that were extremely difficult to sustain under combat conditions. It produced chronic mechanical problems across the entire class, and it routinely reduced the operational availability of German destroyers by margins that the fleet's action reports documented with an honesty that official assessments of the force's capability did not always reflect. A Z-class destroyer operating under sustained combat conditions could expect to lose 2 to 4 boilers from mechanical problems during any extended operational period. The boilers were sensitive to water quality, sensitive to the rate at which pressure was raised and lowered, sensitive to the accumulated stress of high-speed running in heavy North Sea weather. Each boiler casualty reduced maximum available speed. A destroyer operating on 4 of 6 boilers was not a destroyer capable of 38.5 knots. She was capable of perhaps 28 to 30 knots. And that changed the tactical equation for every operation that depended on speed as the platform's primary defensive characteristic. The men who maintained the boilers knew this. The engineering petty officers, trained on these systems during the fleet's rapid expansion in the late 1930s, understood the gap between designed capability and sustainable capability, in a way that the tactical planners, one echelon above them, frequently did not. Standing a boiler watch on a Z-class destroyer in the North Sea in November meant monitoring 6 boilers operating at conditions that required constant attention. It meant doing so in a machinery space where the temperature during full power steaming exceeded 50 degrees Celsius. It meant doing so while the ship rolled 25 degrees in Atlantic swells. It meant doing so with equipment whose maintenance intervals had been compressed by the tempo of operations. And it meant doing so with the knowledge that a boiler casualty at the wrong moment during a high-speed approach, during a withdrawal under fire, would reduce the ship's speed at precisely the point when speed meant the difference between escape and destruction. This was not a theoretical concern. It was a documented operational reality throughout the war. The living conditions aboard Z-class destroyers were shaped by the same philosophy that had shaped the engineering plant. Performance over habitability, speed over comfort, offensive capability over anything that did not directly contribute to the ship's ability to hit the enemy and disengage. The crew complement for a Z-class destroyer ran to approximately 315 men. The berthing spaces were below the main deck, divided into compartments by station, forward for the seamen and torpedo ratings, amidships for the engineering department, aft for the gunnery crews. The bunks were fixed pipe frames with thin mattresses, stacked too high in most compartments, rather than the 3 tiers common on larger warships. But the deck space between rows was so narrow that 2 men could not pass each other unless one turned sideways. The North Sea and Norwegian waters, where German destroyers spent most of their operational lives, imposed environmental conditions on these ships and their crews that the Baltic training grounds had not replicated. The men who moved from training into operational service encountered those conditions with an abruptness the official preparation had never fully addressed. The North Sea in winter produces wave heights averaging between 3 and 5 meters, with storm conditions producing 8 to 10 meter swells. A destroyer of 2,400 tons displacement in 8-meter swells is not a stable platform. She moves through a motion that combines rolling, pitching, and corkscrewing at once, at rates and amplitudes that depend on her heading relative to the sea state and her speed. The men aboard Z-class destroyers in North Sea winter operations described a motion that could not be adapted to. It could only be endured. Even men who had been at sea for years reported that extended North Sea operations produced a baseline of physical exhaustion simply from maintaining position. It had nothing to do with workload, nothing to do with combat stress. You adapted, in most cases, within the first weeks of North Sea service, but what you adapted to was not comfort. It was a different baseline of physical functioning. You performed your watch, your maintenance, your damage control drills in a state of chronic mild impairment. The human body registers it as normal once the acute phase of seasickness has passed, but it remains a real reduction in the physical and cognitive resources available for the work the ship requires. Seasickness was universal in the early operational period aboard these ships. This is documented in the medical records of the destroyer flotillas, and it matters because the official portrait of Kriegsmarine destroyer service as an elite, aggressive, high-tempo naval arm did not include this particular detail. Men vomited. The bilges of destroyers operating in North Sea storm conditions accumulated evidence of this in quantities that damage control parties noted in ship's logs with a clinical brevity that said more about the conditions than any dramatic description could. The food was adequate in the early war period. Then it declined steadily as the demands on the German supply system accumulated. The Kriegsmarine provisioned its destroyers on a schedule that provided fresh provisions for the first week to 10 days of an operational sortie, and preserved provisions thereafter. The preserved rations, canned meat, dried vegetables, hardtack, and tinned fish were nutritionally sufficient and gastronomically monotonous, in the same way that preserved military rations on every destroyer in every navy were monotonous. The specific German contribution to this universal problem was sauerkraut. It appeared in the ration with a frequency that surviving crew accounts described so consistently that it became a defining characteristic of the experience. Not always complained about, simply present, always there. A background condition of eating at sea on a German destroyer, the way engine vibration was a background condition of sleeping. By 1942, the supply situation had tightened. The German economy was managing competing demands from the Army, the Luftwaffe, the U-boat construction program, and the entire occupied European territory at the same time. Destroyer crews noticed the change first in the quality of preserved provisions. Older stock, closer to its shelf life limits. Then they noticed it in the fresh provision periods, which shortened as the allocation system prioritized other demands. By 1943, The men aboard German destroyers operating in the Arctic, the northern theater where the destroyer force participated in attacks on Allied convoys supplying the Soviet Union, were eating rations that flotilla medical officers described in official reports as nutritionally marginal for men doing heavy physical labor in sustained cold. The Arctic was the specific environment that German destroyer service produced, which had no equivalent in any other destroyer force's experience. Operations in the Arctic Ocean and Norwegian coastal waters above the Arctic Circle imposed conditions on the destroyer flotillas that even the North Sea, for all its violence, did not replicate. In winter above 70 degrees north latitude, the ambient air temperature on the open bridge of a destroyer making 25 knots ran between -15 and -25 degrees Celsius. The wind chill at those temperatures and speeds produced effective temperatures below -40 degrees Celsius on exposed skin. The open bridge of a Z-class destroyer was not enclosed. It had wind deflectors, curved steel shields that reduced direct wind exposure, but it was not a closed space. It offered no meaningful protection against the temperature. The bridge watch officer and his lookout stood watch for 4 hours in conditions that produced frostbite on exposed skin within minutes and hypothermia in improperly equipped men within the watch period. The equipment issued to bridge watch keepers in Arctic operations was layered wool and leather, no Gore-Tex. No synthetic insulation, no modern thermal management. It worked more or less when dry. But the Arctic seas above Norway are not dry. Spray from a destroyer making speed in Arctic conditions froze on contact with cold metal and cold clothing. Ice accumulated on the ship's superstructure, on the gun mounts, on the torpedo tubes, on the bridge fittings, and on the deck at rates that required constant manual removal. Because the weight of accumulated ice changed the ship's stability characteristics, men with metal tools chipped ice from gun breeches and torpedo tube mechanisms while wearing gloves that reduced dexterity to a fraction of barehanded ability, because the alternative was touching metal with bare skin and losing the skin. There is a number that establishes the specific weight of Arctic destroyer operations in a way no description of individual discomfort can match. Between December 1942 and May 1943, the German destroyer force participated in 2 major operations against Allied Arctic convoys. The first was the Battle of the Barents Sea on December 31st, 1942, when a force including the heavy cruisers Hipper and Lützow and 6 destroyers attacked convoy JW51B in the Arctic Ocean south of Bear Island. The second was a series of smaller operations in the same theater through the spring of 1943. The Battle of the Barents Sea is documented in detail in both German and British records, and what it reveals about the gap between Kriegsmarine destroyer doctrine and operational reality deserves close examination. The German force had overwhelming material superiority over the convoy's escort. The convoy was protected by 6 destroyers, 5 smaller escorts, and no cruisers or capital ships. The German plan called for the heavy cruisers to attack from the south, while the destroyers created a diversion from the north, drawing the British escorts away from the convoy. It was tactically coherent, and it failed. It failed for reasons that illuminate exactly what German destroyer service was in real operational conditions rather than doctrinal language. 3 of the 6 German destroyers experienced boiler casualties during the approach. The high-pressure Wagner plant, operating in Arctic cold after a high-speed run from Norwegian bases, produced exactly the mechanical unreliability that the engineering departments had documented in operational reports throughout 1942. The destroyers that suffered boiler casualties could not maintain formation speed. The attack coordination unraveled. Hipper engaged the British destroyers at close range and withdrew after taking damage, rather than pressing through a screen that doctrine said the heavy cruiser should have been able to penetrate. The convoy was not sunk. Virtually none of it was damaged. The Kriegsmarine lost no ships, but achieved none of its objectives. The action report that reached the Naval War Staff in Berlin produced one of the most consequential reactions of the entire war. Adolf Hitler's fury at the surface fleet's performance triggered Grand Admiral Raeder's resignation and the appointment of Admiral Karl Dönitz, the U-boat commander, as commander-in-chief of the Navy. The surface fleet, including the destroyer force, was subordinated to a leadership that fundamentally believed the submarine was the decisive naval weapon, and the surface combatant was a secondary instrument. The men aboard the destroyers that had been at sea in the Arctic that night, managing boiler casualties in -20 degrees Celsius, while trying to execute a fleet operation against a convoy they never reached, were not present for this institutional realignment. They were navigating the Norwegian coastline in the dark at reduced speed, in conditions their equipment had not been designed for, and they would not learn for some time that the outcome of their particular misery had ended one naval career and rearranged the priorities of the entire fleet they served. The specific incident that reveals what German destroyer service cost at its most concentrated was not in the Arctic. It was in Norway in April 1940, and it was the event that defined the Kriegsmarine's relationship with the destroyer force for the rest of the war. Operation Weserübung, the German invasion of Norway, assigned 10 destroyers to land 2,000 mountain troops at Narvik, in the far north of Norway, simultaneously with other landings along the Norwegian coast. The destroyers were chosen because they were fast enough to make the transit from German ports to Narvik in a single night run. Their shallow draft allowed them to operate in fjord waters that larger ships could not enter. The plan was simple on paper. The destroyers would land the troops, refuel from a tanker that had been prepositioned in Ofot Fjord, and return to German waters before British naval forces could intercept them. But the tanker's fuel was unusable. It had been contaminated with seawater during the transit. The 10 destroyers landed their troops and then found themselves in Ofot Fjord with insufficient fuel to return to Germany. They were trapped. What followed across April 10th and April 13th, 1940, was the two battles of Narvik. The first was a destroyer action. The second was a combined action with the battleship HMS Warspite. And by the end of it, all 10 German destroyers had been destroyed. The British force in the first battle lost 2 destroyers of its own. The second battle was not close. Warspite's 15-inch guns in the confined waters of the fjord gave the trapped German ships no meaningful tactical option. They fought with what they had: their guns, their remaining torpedoes, the seamanship of their captains, and then they were destroyed. Of the approximately 3,130 men aboard the 10 German destroyers at Narvik, approximately 600 were killed in the 2 engagements. Another 2,500 were rescued and eventually made their way back to Germany, where they formed the core of the expanded destroyer force the Kriegsmarine built to replace the ships it had lost. Those survivors carried a specific knowledge that the men who had not been at Narvik did not possess: knowledge of what it felt like to fight a trapped action in a fjord, knowledge of watching sister ships burn in water too shallow to sink cleanly, knowledge of realizing that the tactical disaster had not been created by the enemy's skill alone, and not by their own failure of nerve, but by a planning decision made far above their pay grade. A decision that had accepted the tanker risk and lost the gamble. The Kriegsmarine did not conduct a formal institutional review of what Narvik revealed about the gap between destroyer doctrine and the operational requirements of the Norwegian campaign. It conducted an inquiry into the specific decisions made before and during the operation. It reassigned some responsibilities. Then it rebuilt the destroyer force. But the deeper lesson, that the destroyer force had been committed to an operation whose fuel logistics made survival dependent on a single ship that then failed, was absorbed at the command level and not shared with the enlisted men who would board the next class of destroyers and conduct the next generation of operations. This pattern would remain constant throughout German destroyer service. Institutional decisions made above the crew's visibility shaped the conditions the crew lived with. The men below deck inherited the risk. The officers on the bridge executed the plan. And the men in Berlin rewrote the language afterward. The Channel operations of 1942 illustrated the same pattern from a different direction. Operation Cerberus, the Channel Dash of February 11th through February 13th, 1942, moved the battlecruisers Scharnhorst and Gneisenau and the heavy cruiser Prince Eugen from Brest in occupied France through the English Channel to German ports. The escort for this operation included 6 destroyers of the 5th Destroyer Flotilla, positioned as an inner screen against British torpedo attack. The operation succeeded in the sense that all 3 capital ships reached Germany without being sunk, though Scharnhorst and Gneisenau both struck mines during the transit. It succeeded because the Luftwaffe maintained continuous air cover for the first time in any major Kriegsmarine surface operation. It succeeded also because British attempts to intercept the force, torpedo bombers, destroyer attacks, and capital ship sorties were uncoordinated, inadequately supported, and, in the case of the famous attack by 6 Swordfish torpedo bombers under Lieutenant Commander Eugene Esmond, heroically executed and completely destroyed. All 6 aircraft were lost. No damage was inflicted on the German force. The destroyer crews who escorted the capital ships through the Channel operated for 24 hours in waters where British air and surface forces were attempting to attack them. They operated in weather that reduced visibility. They operated among the navigational hazards specific to the shallow, mine-dense waters of the Channel. And they did so at speeds constrained by the capital ships they were screening, not by the speeds their own tactical doctrine specified. The operation was a success, but it was the kind of success that reveals the underlying condition of a force more clearly than a defeat. The destroyers functioned as a screen. They absorbed the threat environment. They delivered the capital ships. They were used in the precise functional sense as a buffer between the ships the Kriegsmarine valued most and the forces trying to reach them. The enlisted men who stood watch in North Sea squalls, in Arctic freeze, and in Channel fog did not think of themselves as buffers. They thought of themselves as destroyer men, and the specific culture of the German destroyer force, shaped by the losses at Narvik, by the operational tempo of North Sea sorties, and by the peculiar combination of high technical demand and physical hardship imposed by the Z-class platform, was a culture that the external portrait of Kriegsmarine naval service had never accurately represented. It was also a culture the men carried with them into post-war Germany, under circumstances that made the entire naval war a subject of complicated memory. It was not easy to examine, and so, for many, it was easier not to examine it at all. The medical costs of German destroyer service are documented in fleet medical records and post-war veteran health studies with a specificity the recruitment materials never anticipated. Hearing loss from sustained exposure to the 12.7 centimeter main battery in open or semi-open mounts was near universal among gun crew veterans. A Z-class destroyer's main battery firing a full salvo produced muzzle blast overpressure at the mount positions that exceeded any safe sustained exposure threshold by a considerable margin. Hearing protection was issued, earplugs and, for some positions, ear-covering devices. But the practical usability of hearing protection in combat, where verbal orders and target reports were the primary communication system, was limited. Men took the protection off so they could hear. Then the guns fired, and they lost hearing incrementally over months and years of service. Many noticed the loss only when the guns were gone, and the silence they moved into was not the silence they remembered. Cold injury from Arctic service was also documented extensively. Frostbite among bridge watchkeepers and deck crews on Arctic operations was not an unusual casualty. It was routine. It was managed in the ship's sickbay with the same matter-of-fact attention that medical officers gave to more dramatic injuries. Chronic cold exposure produced long-term vascular damage in the extremities of men who had stood bridge watches in minus 20 degrees Celsius for months of Arctic operations. That damage expressed itself in the post-war years as circulation problems, temperature sensitivity, and, in severe cases, the specific peripheral vascular condition German medical literature of the 1950s, associated with extended cold weather military service without adequate protection. Then there was the psychological weight, and this burden was harder to record. After Narvik, German destroyer men served in a surface fleet whose leadership had been replaced by a submarine admiral openly skeptical of the surface combatants' value. They conducted operations increasingly defined by what the destroyers could not be risked for, rather than what they could do. They watched the U-boat arm receive priority in construction, manning, and institutional attention. While the destroyer force was used for escort and coastal defense missions, that doctrine had not classified as primary roles. The Kriegsmarine personnel system was not designed to address that kind of accumulation. Combat fatigue as a formal category did not receive institutional recognition in the German military in anything like the limited acknowledgement it received in American and British forces. A German destroyer man who had been through Narvik, North Sea winters, and Arctic operations, and who, by 1944, found himself escorting coastal convoys in the Baltic against Soviet air and submarine attacks, had no institutional mechanism for the weight he was carrying. His equipment was increasingly difficult to maintain, his fleet was increasingly unable to replace what it lost. His war had narrowed from aggressive doctrine to survival, escort, evacuation, and endurance, but the ship still required him. The service still required him. So he stood his watch. He maintained his equipment. He conducted his drills. The options were what the options had always been. The Baltic Campaign of 1944 and 1945, the final operational period for most surviving German destroyers, was shaped by a mission the original doctrine had never assigned. And the men who performed it understood its full implications without requiring any official briefing. As Soviet forces advanced through the eastern Baltic states in 1944, the German Army's Army Group North was cut off and required evacuation by sea. The Kriegsmarine organized Operation Hannibal, the largest naval evacuation in history, moving approximately 25,000 German soldiers, civilians, and refugees from Baltic ports to western Germany between January and May 1945. The destroyers that survived from the pre-war force and the wartime building program participated in this evacuation as escorts, anti-submarine screens, and in some cases as direct transports of refugees when no other ships were available. This was not the cutting edge of naval power the recruitment materials had described. It was desperate humanitarian rescue conducted in waters where Soviet submarines, aircraft, and mines operated freely. It was carried out in ships whose maintenance state had been compromised by 5 years of war and shrinking spare parts. And it was carried out by men who had been at sea long enough that the life they had lived before the war could be reached only through letters from home. Letters that arrived less often as the German postal system collapsed under the weight of the Allied strategic bombing campaign. The specific documented incident that captures what German destroyer service meant at its endpoint comes not from a battle. It comes from an evacuation. It comes from January 1945. The men who pulled survivors from the Baltic that night were doing it in conditions that the doctrine they had trained under had classified as tactically inadvisable. They did it because the people in the water required it, and because there was no one else. One of those men was Obermatt, Petty Officer Heinrich Rademacher of the torpedo boat T-36, which was among the vessels at the scene of the Wilhelm Gustloff sinking and participated in rescue operations through the night of January 30th and into the morning of January 31st, 1945. Rademacher was 23 years old. He was from Rostock, a port city on Germany's Baltic coast, and he had entered the Kriegsmarine in 1940. Too late for Narvik. Early enough for the North Sea operations, early enough for the Arctic, early enough for the full arc of what the surface fleet's war had become. By January 1945, he had been at sea, with only brief port intervals, for more than 4 years. On the night of January 30th, 1945, the German liner Wilhelm Gustloff, carrying an estimated 10,582 people, primarily German civilian refugees, but also wounded soldiers and naval personnel, was sunk in the Baltic by the Soviet submarine S-13. She went down in approximately 40 minutes. The death toll was the largest in maritime history. Estimates run between 8,000 and 9,400 dead. German destroyers and torpedo boats in the area rescued approximately 1,252 survivors. The ships that conducted that rescue were operating in water temperatures of minus 2 degrees Celsius, seawater that could kill an immersion victim in minutes without immediate extraction. They operated in darkness. They operated in a submarine threat environment that made stopping to conduct rescue operations genuinely dangerous to the rescuing ships. The account Rademacher gave in an interview recorded by the German Naval Archive in Hamburg in 1962, 17 years after the war ended, described that night in the Baltic with the precision of a man who had spent 17 years knowing exactly what he had seen and had not yet found the right occasion to say it all. He described the temperature of the air. He described the temperature of the water. He described what the survivors looked like when they were pulled over the side. Civilians, women, children, soldiers, all mixed together in the water, in the dark, some of them coherent. Some already past the point where coherence was still available to them. He described the specific weight of a child pulled from Baltic water in January. He described where his hands were, what they were doing, what he was looking at when he understood that there were more people in the water than could be pulled out before they died. He described making the calculation, though not in those words. He said he simply knew, at some point during the night, how many they had pulled aboard, how many were still in the water, and what the water temperature was doing to the ones still in it. He said he knew before the rescue was over how the arithmetic was going to resolve, and he said he continued working anyway. Because the next person he could reach was the next person he could reach. And in that moment, that was the only calculation that mattered. He said he thought about the water temperature. He said he had never stopped knowing, in a precise and automatic way, what the water temperature was in any body of water he was near. This was not knowledge he had decided to retain. It had simply remained. The way certain knowledge remains when the conditions that installed it were specific enough and final enough. After the war, Rademacher returned to Rostock, which was in the Soviet occupation zone and became East Germany. He worked in the shipyards. He married in 1948. He had 3 children. He attended no veterans reunions because the institutional framework for German naval veterans in the German Democratic Republic was not one that encouraged or facilitated them. And because the specific nature of what the Kriegsmarine surface fleet had done in the Baltic in the war's final months was not something the post-war political landscape on either side of the German division was well positioned to examine with the honesty it required. He was 40 years old when he gave the Hamburg interview. He had been working in the Rostock shipyard for 15 years. The interviewer asked him what he thought about when he worked near the water. He died in 1987 at the age of 65. His children, in a brief account published in a local Rostock historical journal in 1993, described him as a man who was quiet about the war in the way that men of his generation were often quiet about it. And they said he had kept a single photograph in a box in the bedroom closet throughout his life. Not a photograph of a ship, not a photograph of the men he had served with, a photograph of the Baltic coast near Rostock in winter. Taken at some point he had never specified. The water in the foreground, gray, flat, very cold looking. The horizon in the background, and nothing else. His children did not know why he kept it. They kept it after he was gone. By the end, that was the truth the Kriegsmarine had never put into its fleet orders. Not the rhetoric of speed, not the promise of initiative, not the clean image of destroyers striking hard, disengaging fast, and vanishing into the sea mist as the elite edge of German naval power. The truth was machinery pushed beyond what it could sustain. Boilers failing in Arctic darkness, men vomiting in North Sea storms and then standing watch anyway. Hands freezing to metal, ears slowly ruined by gunfire, ships trapped in fjords because one logistical gamble failed. Destroyers turned into screens for capital ships, destroyer men turned into rescue crews in a dying sea war. And finally, in the Baltic winter, a young petty officer pulling one more person from water cold enough to decide life and death in minutes, while already knowing there were too many people in the dark. That was German destroyer service. Not the doctrine, not the recruitment language. The lived reality. A war of speed that became a war of endurance. A fleet built for attack, forced again and again into conditions it could not master. And men who had been told they were the cutting edge, only to learn that a cutting edge can also be the first thing driven into stone.